Hello, it's Richard Pears from FinextraTV, and delighted today to be joined by our good friend Martina Macpherson. Good morning to you. Martina is really one of the absolute eminent people in the sustainable finance space. I'm really thrilled to get her insights today. So Martina is at ODDO BHF, and she'll tell us a bit more about that in a moment, but also as part of being head of the ESG strategy in the General Management Committee. She's also president at the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets and a visiting professor at Henley Business School. So really looking forward to this conversation today. How are you?
Thank you, Richard. Very well. Great to be here on again.
Yeah, last time was when you were at Moody's, which is about a year ago. Tell us a bit about the journey and transition that's taken you to ODDO.
Very interesting times and busy times indeed, Richard. So first of all, I sticked to my aims to move back into investment management, where I spent the first decade of my now 20-year career in investment management and of course financial services more broadly, with a strong focus on SRI, ESG, increasingly impact. And ultimately, I was able now to support and enable ODDO BHF Asset Management's transition to meet the new regulatory and normative requirements, especially around transparency. And I know we will touch on this today, disclosure and reporting around ESG, to literally support also their IT and technology transformation. So from transition to transformation, in line with ESG data requirements, especially for our proprietary model and methodology for ESG analysis. And last but not least, to establish a new active ownership concept and a function for collaborative engagement, supporting the climate, ecological, and just transition. More on this very shortly.
Well, thanks for that. And as we said before we started, you're very steeped in this, you're very experienced in this. There's a lot of people that are new to this world, and it's quite confusing. So, you're active across many groups, both in your previous role and your current role. What are the key things, the key groups, the key people that people should be really paying attention to in amongst this, blizzard of acronyms of organizations all trying to help? But where would you put people's focus?
An important question, Richard. And it's interesting. One of our media agencies had asked me most recently if I would be interested in developing a ranking and a rating of these groups in relation to materiality and relevance. We are not there yet, but
yeah, it's going to be useful. I'll find it very helpful if you would.
Yes, exactly. Well, pleasure. Then definitely that is a research project, but it can give you some of the ideas. What are the decisive factors for us at ODDO in order to choose and commit time and resources, and of course costs, to membership groups, coalitions, working group efforts, and of course consultations. Maybe to summarize: intentionality, commonality, additionality, and impact. We have heard these sort of factors many different times. Here in the context for us concretely, it means we look at collaborative engagement partners. We look at partners that are supporting our ESG strategy in regards to the vision and mission that are highlighted around the climate, ecological, and just transition, and that actually can help us to identify and establish positive change trajectories and pathways linked to these ambitions. So maybe, again, concretely some examples. It comes at no surprise that we have chosen groups for our engagement and dialogue that include the PRI and the UN Global Compact, very high level but important principles and standard setters. And then more specifically for climate, TCFD, Climate Action 100 Plus, the Investor Agenda, CDP, and most recently, the Coalition for Climate Resilience in Investment. For biodiversity, the Finance Pledge for Biodiversity, TNFD, and now up and coming Nature 100 Plus, and IPDD, also very important in the context of sovereign biodiversity engagement. Jane Ambartse, I think, once classified this during her times at Mercer as the next frontier for ESG engagement, the type of engagement, the sovereign engagement that we need to also address some of the broader and systemic risks. And then last but not least, of course, for the just transition, Finance for Tomorrow and the World Benchmarking Alliance, where we co-lead these type of collaborative investor groups. And then secondly, we look actually for effective and targeted groups and efforts that are shaping the future of our industry, forward-looking perspective. That means we work directly with and indirectly with normative and regulative standard setters. So we co-chair the ICMA's SFDR working group for investors. We participate proactively in working groups by, for instance, the European Law Institute on sustainability frameworks. We also participate locally, and I sit on working groups with FinDatX and globally with the Enterprise Data Management Council to assess data and frameworks and relevant concepts for sustainability. And then, of course, last but not least, we have a particular interest to shape the thought leadership debate. So here again, to highlight the European Risk Management Council and CFA's ESG leadership groups. And what this ultimately means as well is that some of these groups, hopefully all of them, deliver co-benefit that mean information and knowledge exchange on the one hand, access to new networks, and of course, thought leadership positioning and opportunities for BHF asset management.
Well, that's really a lot in there, but it's helpful. And I think, people are going to have to do their homework. And I know you've got some follow-on documents that you might be able to share with people. But if you right at the beginning, it was interesting. You sort of spoke about, that journey through responsible investing to impact. Where do you think the industry is at, if you gave it a kind of scorecard from, I guess if you're the person sitting on the M25, blocking the traffic, you're a young protester about inaction, they wouldn't understand all of this necessarily, or they would say, where is the impact? Where's the outcome? Where do you think the industry is in terms of actually getting to outcomes that people can understand?
Very important. I think we have definitely seen a transition, not a transformation yet. When we look at, when we started the debate around more ethical implications, socially responsible investments, and a specific area in investing that was very often using exclusion criteria to reflect this particular investor interest appetite, may that be institutional or retail, ourselves as consumers. And ultimately, we have come quite a long way from there. We have talked about mainstreaming of ESG many times, but ultimately now, when we are looking at the next frontier again of what we need to do, we ultimately need to look at assessing, you highlighted it, outcomes, outputs, and ultimately impacts. And this type of journey will also help us to define more broadly where we need to be as an industry. I'm talking here really amongst and for the investor community, but also in order to build the bridge back to consumers, to the people on the street that you'd highlighted, who are actually having similar vision and missions, but maybe slightly different ambitions to get to the same outcomes. But I had similar discussions in the past, even with members of the European Commission, DG FISMA, Mario Nava at the time, to say we cannot leave, the next generation out and off the table. In order to bring them back from a policy engagement perspective, we need to really engage with them, bring them to the decision-making tables and to the discussion tables in the first place. And as investors, we need to have an ear for these developments and tie the expectations of clients, the future customers and existing customers, the future beneficiaries of pension funds, potentially the existing corporate pension funds, back together with ultimately understanding what we are trying to achieve. So let me explain what that means. Dialogue and engagement needs to literally focus on multiple stakeholder groups. We had this discussion yesterday with the World Benchmarking Alliance when setting our targets for a collaborative investor coalition. We need to focus on building awareness. We need to then work with investors to prepare for actions. Likewise, side by side, opening the streams of corporations and other stakeholders in society at large to actually build further capacity. Then we need to work with the investor community on targets, KPIs, and ultimately means for implementation. And then again, we shouldn't also forget the last step, which people always identify with now regulatory requirements, which means transparency and disclosure, hence communication around some of these key issues. And for all of this, Richard, we need change agents, and how to engage and bring these change agents to the fore within an organization is, I'm sure, something we can touch on a bit later again.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, if you like, I've asked the question on behalf of the young protester. There's also, the financial professional protester who's sort of going, well, I've never done this stuff before. I've just worried about fiduciary and financial disclosures. Suddenly you're asking me to take on climate change, and also here comes biodiversity. And why do we need biodiversity? What's this COP15? I thought we were at COP26. What's this all about? And why do we need to focus on biodiversity when we are doing climate change? Perhaps asking that and on behalf of the financial professional who's starting to get a bit confused themselves.
Also very important questions and very timely, as you just highlighted, for instance, biodiversity, COP15, biodiversity COP. We are just having another discussion in a few months around COP26, of course, the climate COP. Just to take a few steps back, I think we need to have, and again, building awareness, building capacity also means education and understanding. So for that effort, again, we have been working with many different experts in the industry, in academia, amongst NGOs and policymakers and standard setters. And we completed the Routledge Handbook on Biodiversity and Species Extinction, which is now imminently being published, and very timely so, because global warming and the progressive destruction of biodiversity and natural capital, ecosystem services, are not isolated problems, but they are interrelated and they affect each other. When we look at pervasive human-driven pollution, climate change, and ever-increasing use of land and overconsumption, then we just look at some of the determining factors that are contributing to this, what we call dangerous loss of biodiversity, natural habitat, and of course, species, which in turn results in the overall loss of ecosystem services. And this loss and extinction crisis, as it has been classified, has a global economic impact. The World Bank estimates that the global economy could lose up to $2.7 trillion year on year, latest by 2030 onwards. And these figures probably need to be corrected if we look at the implications around wildfires, sea level rises, the ever-changing weather patterns, down to climate change, but with direct impacts, obviously, for natural habitat, for biodiversity and species, but ultimately also for impoverished regions. I think we had in Madagascar the first direct links in the context of climate justice, when it were social implications and the loss of habitat also for societies was directly linked and could be tracked and traced to the implications of climate change. But again, a step back here, we have these economic impacts, and that ultimately means we need to now work with policymakers, we need to work with regulators, as well as with other industry participants and NGOs and academia as knowledge experts plus science, to ultimately harmonize existing frameworks and metrics we use for ESG and climate risk assessments. And that can help us to target a bit of the alphabet soup that is still in existence within ESG, to address aggregate confusion when we look at specifics around data and methodologies, and hopefully to prevent some of the reporting fatigue, which is already quite prevalent amongst corporations, but also is becoming an increasing issue for investors. So with SFDR, which is the European Disclosure Regulation, which literally mandates investors to report on sustainability risks, including biodiversity, as of July 2022 latest, we now need to better prepare in order to harmonize and in order to build capacity. A last note here again, when we wrote the book, we looked at 50 plus frameworks, standards, labels, and else that actually include biodiversity criteria, metrics, and methods. And some of these methods and frameworks align, others are inherently and fundamentally different. Some provide a financial, others a dual materiality perspective. Some of them look at the assessment perspective from the corporate externality standpoint. Others look at, for instance, more specifically at economic or ecosystem services impacts. So that means now that the EU is working on establishing an alignment around classification frameworks and categories for green, no green, light green, dark green, and potentially social issues going forward. And when and where we can more definitely and concretely talk about permissible activities for investing in line with the assessment of adverse principal impacts, more should now be done to align these specific developments at a national level. One, for instance, if you look at France, where climate and biodiversity risk disclosures have already become mandatory, alongside Article 173, the so-called Decree 29, the Decree 29, but which goes side by side with what has been defined and developed at the EU level. And then, of course, secondly, we should look at the developments at a global level, where existing and new standard setters, especially accounting bodies now, such as IFRS, are emerging. And when and where we have the unique opportunity and time frame window now for the next 2 years to build global alignment on these prevailing issues, to again build more awareness, understanding, to build commonality, but ultimately also to create more harmonization so that we are not ending up in a few years with different methods on the one hand, but clearly also with different outcomes when we look at reporting disclosures of risks, and ultimately then the fraction that this might bring in regards to specifically here in Europe, regulation around disclosure of these risks. And that in turn would probably turn a lot of investors away again from the important work we all have established here over the last 20 years plus.
Yeah, and with climate change, obviously we can say, well, we have net zero, we have measuring of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is, a very measurable thing, and obviously the price of carbon as a market mechanism. With obviously nature, we don't really have those kind of clear, even though they may have some sort of bluntness to them, they're very clear. How do we, do you think that everything you spoke about in terms of harmonization, the ability to sort of assess, do you think that the COP15 and the 30 by 30, 50 by 50, I think it is, ambitions are the sort of level that we need to be aiming for at the headline level? And then what would you think needs to be done at the sort of, if you like, more substantial levels to make sure that people know how to do what you've said in terms of assessing risk and opportunity?
Very good question. I think now's the time to really look at the headline level as you described it, to ensure we have the relevant frameworks and standards in place. We also need to move the industry from principles to rules-based approaches. I've said that in many different shapes and forms. Principles are important to build scale. If we look at the ICMA Green Bond principles, if we look at the PRI, 6 principles for responsible investment, these have all helped to build a loose framework to enable to scale up an industry when and where it was needed. But once you've come to a tipping point now where we need to build products and where we have specific, say, disclosure requirements, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we need stricter, more descriptive taxonomies. I would also maybe revert back on stricter, because there's also the challenge with stricter, meaning you are deferring away from the aims and you're creating then a rules-based taxonomy, for instance, which becomes so hard to follow that in turn, again, you lose market participants and ultimately investment feasibility on the way. And this is what I see currently as a big challenge with the existing labels, something we haven't touched on so much, but which will become increasingly more complex and important, given that labels and fund ratings, for instance, are indicators that retail, but increasingly also institutional investors are using to get an indication around the greenness of a fund, especially more at a pan-European or even a global level. And given that all of them follow different methodologies and have specific requirements, again, which are not necessarily aligned with each other and not aligned with what we are seeing the European Commission is planning with a new eco label, there is obviously risk of fragmentation and confusion. So again, stepping back, higher level aims, alignment, maybe through the platform, International Platform for Sustainable Finance, these type of big capacity building efforts that have been set up to help scaling the industry. And hopefully we will see, and I've been part of some of these discussions, we will hopefully see more alignment between normative standard setters, labels providers, as well as ultimately now accounting bodies and framework and standard setters with, the developments we're here seeing at the European level. And then, of course, the UK is building its own taxonomy, and classification system side by side. But then the next step, and more concretely, we need to look at the industry. We need to look at ourselves and need to understand of how we can actually build the frameworks we need to then ultimately implement, coming back to that example for biodiversity, to implement specific initiatives, criteria, and build methods linked to data, linked to portfolio construction, linked to engagement that can enable us to ultimately reflect these important requirements. And if I may quickly give you an example of how we do that at ODDO BHF Asset Management. I mean, I've highlighted we measure risk, we look at opportunities, we look at the links, the interconnectedness between climate and biodiversity and other environmental issues specifically, but increasingly also how they tie in with S issues, hence, the reference back to the just transition.
Yeah.
But for, biodiversity, what we have done is we have, first of all, top down, created a group-wide exclusion policy for the asset management firm and the wealth management / trust divisions to comply on the one hand with ESG regulation in France, but also preempting, foreseeing taxonomy alignment EU, which already has a biodiversity category, and of course, SFDR disclosure requirements. And of course, last but not least, we ourselves have applied and have already in existence various labels for our funds. So we have actually done the exercise of mapping through the policy and through transparency codes the various requirements at all of these levels. And that is a challenging exercise. That costs knowledge, internal proprietary research and analyses, hence the importance of an ESG team. It also requires obviously alignment with key stakeholders, from product development, which funds are you aiming to establish and look at in the future versus what you've got now? Do you need to transform, not just transition, some of these vehicles? Other discussions, right? Compliance and legal. Where do you need and how do you align with the existing and up and coming regulatory frameworks? And what does that mean for the organization? And so on and so on. Of course, investment feasibility, right? So that means building this policy was key. And then defining the specific criteria. We have looked at this from a risk lens, Richard. So we've literally come to this with firm-wide exclusion, saying that biodiversity risks give us literally two ways to assess the issues, because we don't have the TCFD framework per se, as we do for climate, and the many different layers of science-based targets initiatives in other areas that can calculate these risks more precisely. So we literally looked at this particular biodiversity risk context from two angles. One is risks related directly to a specific sector or industry, in this case, palm oil. And the second one, a bit more broader, looking at environmental damage linked to biodiversity. And that means for the first exclusion list relating to palm oil, we are literally using various NGOs and MSCI's exclusions lists. We have our own ESG team that looks at the materiality of controversies linked to companies in the palm oil industry. And we look at specific thresholds. So in our exclusion list, we have identified companies that generate more than 5% of their revenues from activities in the palm oil industry, and that violate sustainability principles as defined by certification bodies, in this case here, RSPO 14. And then we look, as I said, more broadly at reliable methods and indicators for measuring a company's environmental footprint, even though many of these are still at an early stage. And we are building, by the way, our own current emphasis on assessing biodiversity risk data. There's a feasibility study / a paper based on that study that we are issuing in the next 2 months. So watch this space. It will, of course, be widely available to the industry. But again, we are there looking for broader track records of known environmental violations and controversies for this particular exclusion list. And that means on this list, we see that we look at companies whose activities have a negative impact on biodiversity and who do not pursue a clear and credible strategy to preserve and protect. I mean, this is ultimately at the center of what we're trying to do. And that's why we're seeing that there is a link back to companies that we exclude who actually either utilize chemical products and that have a significant impact, because you've asked me about impact. In this case, it's the impact on pollution and degradation of ecosystems. When we look at waterways, forests, soils, and living species. So a holistic view in this vacuum now, when and where specific measures are still under development. But we're trying to fill that void by having developed our own methodology. And again, by aligning ourselves with a top-down policy and then a specific process and a measurement around, specific exclusion criteria. And then last but not least, we are integrating some of this analyses, obviously across boards when and where we are looking at our funds, but more specifically also when we have developed thematic funds. In this instance, last year already, we launched the Green Planet Fund, which is a thematic fund, which already uses some of these methods to identify best-in-class companies here in this specific arena. And last but not least, and then I'm really handing back to you, sorry for this lengthy explanation, but I think it's important because it's such an important question how to do this, right? You also cannot achieve impact without a longer term perspective and without running a portfolio construction emphasis, without the active ownership concept and approach. And here again, highlighting together with other investors, we have been, identifying relevant and credible organizations, and ultimately are now at that stage where we are identifying benchmarks that can help us to assess broader long-term impacts that we want to engage on. So we see really Nature 100 Plus as one of these key efforts. We are seeing IPDD spearheaded by the World Economic Forum and also by Blue Bay Asset Management as a means to go beyond corporates towards sovereigns, and so on and so on. But I think in order to achieve long-term impact, we can, same as for climate, only do this collaboratively.
Amazing discourse, thank you. And one final question that I have to ask, because obviously a lot of our audience are from the sort of climate tech, fintech community, and they're listening to this and they're thinking, how can I help with, the technical capabilities that I have? And I know you're very steeped in understanding around, machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc. But I guess my question would be, when you look at all of this, it is very, very complex. And, if we just use an analogy, which I love to do, if we are driving a car today, most of us are still looking in the rear view mirror about where we've just come from as a way of managing the risk. We're looking backwards through a small piece of glass. But if you're driving the most modern vehicles, you've probably got a radar, LiDAR, which is looking 2 or 3 cars ahead, and it's warning you as you sit there in your autonomous vehicle about what may be happening ahead of you. How can we bring that sort of reduction of complexity for the driver, but actually an enhanced sense of the future risk? How do we bring technology to make it somewhat more autonomous, but a better decision-making investment world?
You're touching on very important points here. The one is the forward-looking perspective that we highlighted many occasions and definitely is very applicable here when we talk about systemic risk and opportunities. Then we should take that one step further and draw down on, okay, how do we classify risks? If we use, for instance, the TNFD framework, which is very similar to the TCFD framework for climate in its approach, you look at transition risks and you, of course, look at physical risks. And transition risks can be mapped out against, for instance, policy developments and trajectories. And we know from a climate policies perspective and trajectory, and that's currently reflected in many of the reports by the IEA, by IPCC and others, that we are obviously on a trajectory that surpasses the current predictions far beyond, 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. The similar sort of predictions and pathways have not yet been established in full for, say, risks such as biodiversity, but frameworks have. So let's again back to TNFD now and physical, for instance, physical biodiversity risk. I think without unlocking the potential of literally looking at work that's been done by the Green Digital Alliance, but specifically also by technologies that are already out there. 427, Moody's and others have been trying to really establish how they could utilize satellite technology and how they could identify location specific and context specific in that context risks on the ground that might ultimately then provide a sovereign perspective as well as a corporate perspective sector specifics perspective on, risks such as nature risks and environmental risks, here specifically biodiversities and species. I think without measuring and tracking ultimately progress, we cannot make assumptions here for the future, and we hence definitely need the latest technology in order to identify the risks. And again, for us as investors here with ODDO, we have started the journey. I attached in one of my emails to you, Richard, and please feel free to share this more broadly. We have looked at the implications of using fintech and AI, not so much directly yet for the latest technology itself and how ultimately we can capture directly data, say from satellite imagery, sensor technology and others, but specifically how we can use AI, natural language processing in this context, and ultimately the ambitions of semantic mapping of environmental, specifically green and biodiversity risks. And we are using this technology already quite frequently for the Green Planet Fund that I highlighted, because we are screening a vast universe of different type of issues, particular controversies, to get a better understanding of the companies we have in our portfolio and to really get a real-time update on when and where potential biodiversity and environmental risks, violations, controversies might occur. And in that same white paper specifically, we're also talking about the importance of looking at tracking, monitoring and tracking the types of risks, identifying relevant providers. And we talk about the limitations of the conventional and current ESG data, points, providers, and methodologies, as well as the complexity of the frameworks that we see that come with this. And last nudge here, again, highlighted the Routledge Handbook on Biodiversity and Species Extinction, which Professor Dr. Jill Atkins from University of Sheffield and myself have co-edited. Here you will see many different important insights, also from the Green Digital Alliance, from the TNFD and others, on frameworks, on metrics, on products, on innovation, but also on outstanding challenges. Some areas such as the sovereign engagement, some areas of digitalization, harmonization of frameworks that we still need to capture and tackle. And watch this space. I'm delighted to talk more about this once it's out.
Fantastic. Well, we're definitely going to have you back, and I know you're helping us out a bit on our next Sustainable Finance Live on supply chains, which is so important. So I'll let you go. Thank you so much. I'll be going back over this interview a few times, I think, and unpicking it. So I hope you enjoyed it as well. But for now, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. Great to see you again. Speak soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.